All right, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk About Things. I'm Jonathan Reutenberg, and today I want to talk about an issue that I think relates to small government, which is the use of capital punishment in the United States. For those of you who don't know by this point, I oppose the use of capital punishment. I think it's it's interesting that that Republicans will claim to be the party of small government, but many of them are supportive of this practice, which, in my opinion, is the epitome, the ultimate manifestation of big government. So, and it's also the state should not be in the business of ending lives. That's what I really do believe. Um, but I am focused on one particular effort to repeal capital punishment, which is in the state of Nevada. And the state of Nevada, I haven't seen any updates in the past little bit. I've been following the state. I have a friend who's covering that. But I want to talk about more broadly why the use of capital punishment is declining overall in the United States. And this is going to be overall a three-part series, and it's going to be divided in three parts. One, the states that have abolished capital punishment, the states that have not but haven't used it in a while, and the states that still do use it. And I'm going to talk about how in all three of those cases are an example of the death penalty, being applied less and less. So give me one moment. I'll be right back and I will show you what I'm talking about. So you will notice that I'm on the Wikipedia page for capital punishment, use of capital punishment in the United States. And on the top right corner of your screen is an animation that basically shows the history of capital punishment repeal and reinstatement over the course of the past 50 years. And this is a more comprehensive timeline, and I can give you basically a brief history about about the abolition of capital punishment over the years. The first state to do so was Michigan back in 1847. It has it is the only state on this list that has never had an execution. And it actually was admitted as a state without the death penalty, and it was banned in its constitution when it was admitted to the Union. It is one of three states that were admitted as not death penalty states. Well, then a few years later, Wisconsin abolished it, followed by Maine in 1887, which became the first northeastern state to do so. And then Minnesota in 1911. Basically, all three of those upper Midwestern states by 1911 have abolished the death penalty. Puerto Rico becomes the first modern day territory to abolish the death penalty 92 years ago. Alaska and Hawaii did so in 1957 and were admitted as non-death penalty states. Iowa and West Virginia abolished the death penalty in 1965. And this is back when Democrats controlled the state, and when I think there was a bit of a different political culture that has transformed since since that time. Iowa and West Virginia, I think, have become a bit more conservative, maybe than they were in the 1960s, because the governments were able to abolish the death penalty at that time. I'm not sure if they would have been able to do it today, given the new political realities in both Iowa and West Virginia. But they were able to get it done then. Vermont followed suit in 1972, and this is the year that the Supreme Court basically says to stop all executions. Well, because at the time executions were very arbitrarily applied. And there was an overall concern that that multiple provisions of the Constitution were being violated. So they put a moratorium on all executions in 1972. And it's gonna show in the animation on the top right. But basically a bunch of states right there repealed their death penalty statutes in 1973, but almost all of them reinstated it. And of that wave, by that point where it was like 30, about only 15 states had the death penalty, and but almost all of those states that repealed in that initial wave would reinstate. Only North Dakota was the only one that did not do so. District of Columbia, no surprise, abolished the death penalty in 1981. Massachusetts and Rhode Island had their death penalty statutes overturned in 1984. New York did so also in 1984, but it would be reinstated in 1995. And something that is important to note about that is, the states that have reinstated the capital punishment. Wyoming doing so in 1977, um, South Dakota doing so in 1979, Kansas doing so in 1994, and New York, reinstating and then having it struck down in the 2000s. But it was reinstated in 1995. Like what I meant to say was it was reinstated in 1995 before being struck down in the 2000s. That is the last time that the death penalty has been formally reinstated in any state in the United States. That there has not been a single instance in the 21st century of the death penalty being reintroduced in any state. And that is something important to keep in mind, because that really shows that the momentum has been towards the abolition of capital punishment. But as you can see, New Jersey repealed it in 2007. It says 2007 for New York. It might have actually been 2004 that the court struck down the death penalty in that state. New Mexico did so in 2009, but they retained the existing death sentences at the time, but those were overturned in 2019, so there's no one on death row anymore. Same thing with New Jersey, but the outgoing governor in 2009 commuted all the sentences. Illinois did so 2011. Connecticut, 2012. Again, they kept all the remaining death sentences, but those were overturned by the state Supreme Court in 2015. Maryland did so in 2013, again preserving all the death sentences, but the outgoing governor in 2014, commuted all of them. Delaware had its death penalty struck down in 2016. Washington in 2018. New Hampshire, the Democratic legislature at the time overturned Governor Chris Sununu's veto to abolish the death penalty in 2019. You can see here that it has not had a single execution since 1939. However, the death penalty repeal in 2019, they basically, just to give you a bit of history, they reinstated it in 1991. It was never used before they repealed it in 2019. But there is someone on death row. There's one person on death row in New Hampshire, and because it was not made retroactive, the latest repeal, that person could still be executed. So that is something worth keeping in mind. They have not had an execution in over 80 years, but they still could. They could still have one more. Colorado did so in 2020, and Virginia became the first southern state to do so in 2021. And which is incredible, because I think they had at one point the highest per capita executions of any state. Their last execution, you can see, was in 2017. But there is one more state that could potentially repeal the death penalty this year, and that is Nevada. They're currently the state assembly has passed Assembly Bill 395, and that has and if it passes the state senate, and the governor signs it, not a guarantee that that'll happen, but if that does happen, then Nevada will be the 24th state to have abolished the death penalty. And it is worth noting that we talked about some of the death penalties being overturned being the result of decision by the state courts. I believe that was the case in Massachusetts, New York, Delaware, and Washington. I believe at least those states had their death penalty statutes overturned by the courts. But it's worth noting that the United States Supreme Court has also applied a number of limits on capital punishment. Based on the Eighth Amendment. Now, I think one at this point could make the reasonable case that the Eighth Amendment actually says the death penalty is cruel and unusual based on what we know about the death penalty. I think you could make the argument that it is cruel and unusual in and of itself, but that the court has not ever sided that way. But it is worth noting that Justice Thurgood Marshall, I believe, was of the opinion that the use of capital punishment in and of itself was unconstitutional. But again, the court has never ruled that way. Maybe they will someday, given everything we know, but we'll have to see. They have, however, put some interesting limits on the use of capital punishment. For example, in the 1800s, in the 1800s, when they were, this is in the 19th century, when they were ruling that the firing squad was unconstitutional, they actually said that certain methods like burning and beheading were cruel and unusual. So there are places in the world, by the way, where they still use beheading. So actually, I could be wrong about that, but um, forget I said that. I actually don't know that for a fact, but it was used historically. But the Supreme Court in the 19th century did say it was unconstitutional. Um, but since 1976, they have also been willing to say in 1988 that you can't. Well, first of all, in 1977, you can't execute someone for rape of an adult. Um, in 1988, they said that you. By the way, for rape of an adult was by the time that they made that ruling, only Georgia and the federal government were still prosecuting for it. And I should mention that of the reinstatements that happened in the 1980s, that one of them was the federal government in 1988. Um, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. But the Supreme Court basically said you can't execute people under the age of 16, um, and when at the time they committed their crime. They expanded on that, by the way, in Roper versus Simmons in 2005, when they finally said you can't execute anyone who committed their crime as a minor. In 2002, they also said that you can't execute someone who is mentally unfit, but in practice, the states get to define what that means. And in 2008, I believe in Kennedy versus Louisiana, they said that you cannot apply the death penalty in crimes against the person that do not result in death. That includes kidnapping that does not result in death, and also includes even child rape that does not result in death. And while I think that, I don't think there is any person in the world, I don't think there's anyone in civilized society that is pro child abuse. But the question then becomes, I had a conversation with someone one time. The conversation is the death penalty an appropriate punishment for child abuse? And I would say no, I don't think it is. And I would say lock such a person up for a long, long time. But I don't believe that the death penalty ought to be used for any crime that but certainly one that does not result in someone being killed. Um, and that's what the court has basically said. Although they have said so, crimes against the state, like treason, could still be sentenced to death for. So that is an important limit. So those are some of the limits that the United States Supreme Court has placed on the use of capital punishment. And people might be wondering where does the court go from there? Honestly, I think that progress, I think, has stalled, particularly with the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy. He was the one who was the author of many of those opinions. And I think with his replacement with Brett Kavanaugh, and certainly with the addition of Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court, I think, has taken more of a turn towards being more death penalty friendly. Like the justices that have been appointed by Donald Trump, have, for example, been trying to loosens they've been questioning the use of appeals as saying that it's more of a delay tactic. So the court may very well decide that they're going to start cracking down on trying to expedite the appeals process. That's what a number of states have been doing. Florida, the Supreme Court, for example, has said you no longer need a unanimous jury to impose the death penalty. The Supreme Court has said you need a unanimous jury, but the Florida Supreme Court thinks that means that you need to be unanimous in order to be eligible for the death penalty, that a non-unanimous jury can impose the death penalty, which, by the way, can happen in Alabama. I think there would need to be a change in state law for that to take effect. But they've also tried to undo they try to loosen up the appeals process in order to make it move faster. Like, for example, the Supreme Court is no longer, I think, automatically reviewing certain death sentences. So I think that means that they can still file an appeal, but I don't think that it happens automatically now. So in Florida, there's been moves to try to make it move faster, and I think the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, is moving in that direction. Um, but it's also, so I think that, and also when you take into mind just I think this past week, when the United States Supreme Court, it might have been earlier this week, in fact, when the United States Supreme Court upheld a sentence of life in prison without parole for someone who committed their crime at the age of 15. I think that that was also something that they were moving towards getting rid of. But I think that that progress has very much stalled. I think the new Supreme Court is very much pro tough on crime. And they are. I think they take a less generous view of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment in particular, in order to allow for more for for more brutal punishments to be imposed in certain cases. So I think we're not going to see a lot from the United States Supreme Court. I think we're going to see a lot of movement though at the state level. So that is something that is worth keeping an eye on. Anyway, that is part one of the series of why the death penalty is declining in use. We've looked at the 23 states, maybe will be 24, that have abolished the death penalty altogether. In part two, I would like to take a look at the states that have not formally abolished the death penalty, but for whatever reason are not conducting executions or have not conducted an execution in a while. So that'll be up in a bit. Anyway, I will see you then.